What's going on, Nostalgics? Welcome back to another video here on the Nostalgia Factor, where we take a look at the best and worst in gaming. And this, guys, is going to be an extremely special episode for me personally. This not only covers one of the most nostalgic games that I played during my childhood, but this also covers one of the more obscure Pokemon games that I feel deserves a lot more attention. And this would be the very first Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team on the Game Boy Advance, developed by Chunsoft and released by Nintendo of America, or Nintendo period, back in 2005. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series is an extremely popular dungeon-crawling sub-series of the larger Pokemon Trainer franchise. This series is still going to this day, with the most recent release, ironically enough, being remakes of the original Pokemon Red and Blue Rescue Team. Now, this series isn't one that I played a lot of in terms of its more recent titles, but I absolutely played the first generation of games and the second generation when it comes to Time, Sky, and Darkness, which could be possible future reviews. But for the sake of today's video, guys, with Pokemon Red Rescue Team, this is a title I can say right off the bat I can absolutely recommend you guys check out for a variety of reasons, and we're going to get into that here. Before we cover the story and the gameplay, which are arguably the biggest elements of this title, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team looks absolutely incredible for a Game Boy Advance title. It has incredibly poppy colors, beautifully designed dungeons that each have their own aesthetic, the sprites and animation of all the Pokemon that you encounter, whether it be in your main hub area of Pokemon Square, or in the various dungeons that you encounter, look absolutely awesome and teeming with life. There are various locations that you encounter throughout the game, especially for the first time in the main story, that each have their own distinct visual aesthetics, whether it be Lapis Cave with the beautiful gleaming crystals, or Mount Blaze when you eventually go through that volcano with the amazing looking lava animation flowing from the top of the volcano all the way down to the base level. All of these things and locations that you encounter add for an incredibly visually stimulating game. Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team looks really good for a Game Boy Advance title, and while it's not the best looking game in the series or anything like that, it's still pretty incredible for when it came out. And the music is a very similar situation. While I don't think it's the best soundtrack in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, there's some incredibly standout tracks, whether they're atmospheric tracks in each of the dungeons that you visit, that add a certain atmosphere or mystique to each location, despite how many times you're going to be going back through these locations for various reasons. And of course, the different main themes that you encounter, whether you're in Pokemon Square, whether your house, or the various friend areas that you can purchase when you recruit more Pokemon to your actual team. The soundtrack in this game is pretty solid overall, and like the visuals, it's pretty impressive for a Game Boy Advance game. No real critiques in either of these departments, and have a listen for yourself to some of these tracks, and you guys will kind of get an idea of what it's like in the game. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon's story is going to be extremely different from your average Pokemon trainer game. This game, you wake up one day as a Pokemon, formerly a human with no memories of your previous life. Having been found by your partner Pokemon of the game, you're setting off on a journey throughout this incredible world in order to figure out who you were and helping Pokemon out in the process. Shortly after some of the opening missions where you rescue a Caterpie and help out his mother Butterfree, you end up deciding to start your own team, with your partner. And depending on your options at the beginning of the game, determining your personality, like there's a personality quiz at the beginning of the game that determines what Pokemon that you are, and then you can select your partner of whomever you choose. I personally always go Pikachu for nostalgic reasons. Plus, it's pretty useful in a lot of boss fights. But regardless of what Pokemon you play as and who your partner is, after this first successful mission, you guys start rescuing other Pokemon and going throughout a journey in order to eventually stop an impending disaster involving a meteor being sent from the heavens that will inevitably destroy the Pokemon and pretty much the entire world. You have various story events that take place in between both the intro, where you're trying to figure out who you are, and the impending disaster, all leading to a pretty good and cohesive journey. The story isn't a particularly long one. All the events that you go through, whether you're rescuing Pokemon, battling against Gengar and his rival team, and ultimately stopping this meteor and discovering your secret past, and eventually becoming a fugitive at one point because you're framed by Gengar. Without going into too many spoilers explaining a lot of these events, this is an extremely cohesive story with some incredibly unique events, kind of like the ones that I just mentioned to you guys briefly. This plot isn't really a long one, and it's not super in-depth, but the events that take place here are incredibly fun. It leads to a pretty emotional journey, especially if this is your first time playing a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game. And the real meat of the plot here isn't really so much within the main story itself. Because after you stop the meteor, you have an entirely long post-game, which is something that these Mystery Dungeon games typically like to do. The story itself, like I mentioned, isn't very long. You could probably beat it within 6 to 7 hours in a straight playthrough, if you know what you're doing, that is. Maybe a bit longer, depending if you do some side content. But the post-game is really where you're going to be investing a lot of time. You're going to be going through new dungeons, you're going to be facing off against new legendary Pokemon. Like your very first intro dungeon after you finish the main game, you're going through the Stormy Sea, battling Kyogre because there are disturbances in the ocean. And the post-game will take you dozens of hours to get through, which could be a critique for some people if you don't want to invest all that time into experiencing the post-game. Despite how lengthy it is still pretty cool to see all these side stories and events that happen. And I really don't have any major issues when it comes to the plot. The only major thing I can really say about it, outside of it being a pretty standard Mystery Dungeon story with some pretty cool and emotional events, is that there are points throughout the main game before you get to the post-game content that it does slow down quite a bit, especially with the Fugitive storyline, because right after that you suddenly start having to solve a bunch of end-of-world events. So the pacing can be off a little bit here and there, but it is an incredibly solid story, and outside of a lengthy post-game, not really many critiques for this one. This is actually a pretty good story. Gameplay in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon is extremely different from the main series, considering that this is a dungeon crawler. Regardless if you're taking on side missions in order to earn money, find items, or what have you, or progressing through the main story, you're going to be going back through multiple different dungeons and areas within the game, whether it be giant volcanoes, caves, forests, what have you. Each of these areas presents a differently randomly generated dungeon. If you played these types of games before, you probably know what to expect from Red Rescue Team. Each of these simulated dungeons has random floor layouts. Each of them have a certain number of floors that you go through. But the different layout, where the staircase is located at to progress to the next area or level, the number of Pokemon that you encounter, and the items that you pick up are all randomly generated. And after a while going through a lot of them, there are different side quests that you can take on to earn more money that are of different types. Whether or not you're going to defeat a specific Pokemon in the dungeon to catch a thief, or you're escorting a Pokemon in order to meet with somebody else in the dungeon, say from floor 1 Could be all the way to floor 10 or more, depending on what dungeon you're going through. Or, if you're going to rescue a Pokemon, you have to make it to a certain point in the dungeon, and then rescue them. You use your badge, they teleport out, you successfully have the mission. Regardless of what you're doing, you are going to be going through these randomly simulated dungeons, and it is incredibly fun. Your movement dictate how fast you move throughout the dungeon, dictates how fast other rival enemy Pokemon catch up to you. You go through these various different corridors, you can pick up items. It's your standard dungeon crawling slash regular Pokemon RPG mechanic, essentially, is what you're going to be doing. So if you played dungeon crawlers before and you know how Pokemon operates, then this gameplay is going to be extremely fun to you. I really do enjoy the gameplay. However, one critique that I do have of it isn't really so much with the gameplay itself, because it's pretty standard regardless if you're doing a boss fight or you're just traveling through the dungeon. It's the fact that it gets pretty samey after a while. What I said earlier about repeatedly visiting these dungeons, whether or not it's a side quest or you're going back through for a particular item or whatever else, it does get repetitive after a while. The layout never really changes too much, the backgrounds are extremely samey, and honestly, you might get sick of it after a while, especially if you're tackling that long post-game that I mentioned before, which is another reason that somebody might have a critique of it, because that post-game does take dozens of hours to get through if you're willing to sink in the time to experience all the side events after the main story takes place. So it can get pretty repetitive after a while, but the core dungeon crawling gameplay, as well as leveling up and your regular Pokemon moves that you would expect from the main series, it's all pretty good stuff. I really don't have any issues with it other than the backtracking and the repetition of going back through these dungeons. While it is pretty solid on its own, that can be an issue in itself. But the gameplay you guys are about to see here, this is essentially what you do throughout the main game. Nothing wrong with it at its core, pretty solid gameplay system, but it gets extremely repetitive after a while. All in all, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team on the Game Boy Advance is an incredible title. This is one of the better Pokemon spin-off games, and definitely a solid start to a brand new series when originally released back in 2005/6. This title sports a lot of really cool and unique things of the Pokemon series, with an original story, good and lengthy post-game, beautiful visuals, a good soundtrack, some pretty good dungeon crawling gameplay combined with the usual Pokemon aesthetics, and despite the fact the game does have some issues, like, again, an incredibly lengthy post-game if you don't like that kind of thing, and definitely repetitive gameplay and dungeon layouts, this is still an incredible title that I loved playing as a kid, and I still think holds up to this day. If you haven't played Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team, do yourself a favor and pick up a copy. I would say pick up the remakes that I had mentioned before on the Nintendo Switch, but honestly, the story, the dialogue, and the way the camera angles and everything else, I don't really think is the optimal experience. If you're interested in it, check it out, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon DX, but at the end of the day, I think you're better off checking out the Game Boy Advance original, but it definitely gets my recommendation regardless. And that does it, guys, for my brief review today of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team. Not really much for me to add on this one without going deep into spoiler territory for the story. At the end of the day, though, this is a really good Pokemon spin-off game, and definitely one you guys should check out if you haven't already. But what do you guys think about Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team? Have you played it before? Is this something you want to experience for yourself? Have you heard good things about it? Let me know your thoughts on the game and the video in the comment section down below. Give the video a like if you guys did enjoy it, and subscribe to the channel if you guys want to catch future videos, including an upcoming 200 subscriber special for Lunar Silver Star Story Complete, whenever it is I get around to doing that particular video. Otherwise, though, guys, thank you guys for all your support once again. It's extremely appreciated. I love bringing attention to older and obscure games, hopefully to encourage some people to check them out if they want. Whole point of the channel. Otherwise, guys, once again, thank you for listening to me ramble about a really good game. Until next time, I'll catch you guys later. Peace out, and keep on gaming.